For the past year, China has been building up islands in the South China Sea. They've been installing runways and radar facilities on the newly minted islands, too. The rest of the world, particularly the Philippines and the United States, are not happy about this. The Philippines even issued a complaint over China's claims on the territory. Yesterday, an international tribunal concluded that China does not have a right to the resources they've claimed in the South China Sea. China, however, did not accept this ruling and released a music video in response titled South China Sea Arbitration, Who Cares? Can't make this stuff up. Take a look.
Who cares?
南海仲裁 Who cares?
南海仲裁 Who cares?
南海仲裁 Who cares?
南海仲裁 Who cares? 南海仲裁
南海仲裁
Who cares?
南海仲裁 Who cares? 南海仲裁 Who cares? Who cares?
Who cares? Who cares? Who cares? Who cares?
Like I said, you can't make this stuff up. Joining me now, geopolitical risk executive John Sitilides. John, thanks for being here.
Great to be here, Liz.
All right, obviously that video, it's quite funny, but on a more serious note, even disregarding this artistic expression of displeasure, do you expect China, in all seriousness, to disregard this ruling?
Well, the president of China has already stated that they're not going to take the ruling seriously at all. And there's been a significant buildup of political rhetoric coming from Beijing in recent weeks and in recent months in anticipation of a possible ruling against China. I don't expect any immediate turn in China's position. However, I do think that China will increasingly recognize that it's not in its interest to engage in any type of provocative activity, to try to ensure that there is no military reaction that is provoked by any Chinese activities in the South China Sea. And hopefully there's even a way for a bilateral dialogue between China and the Philippines, which brought this claim to the Permanent Court of Arbitration, to work out an arrangement that works well for both sides, and then China can engage in negotiations with all of the other countries in or along the South China Sea basin in order to work out an arrangement that allows China to save face, assert its sovereignty claims where they're legitimate, but also allow for prosperity and for good diplomatic relations in one of the busiest places in the world, is where $5 trillion of commerce traverses every year. So we've got to be very careful how we help the Chinese and their neighbors work through this very difficult situation.
Right, and that's an incredible number, $5 trillion of trade that pass through the South China Sea every year. But John, I want to take a step back and paint in the backdrop of this, just so we get an accurate idea of what this conflict is and where it stems from. So the bigger picture here is China has been building up artificial islands in the South China Sea, and then they've been building what look to be military facilities, runways, and radar facilities on these islands, correct?
That's correct. And it's very unfortunate because in many ways the Chinese have painted themselves into a corner without figuring out a way out in case, say, a court ruling would work out against their position. And we need to be very clear here. China is not just a rising power, Liz. It is, in fact, a great power. It is the inheritor of a grand civilization that dates back 5 millennia or so. But it needs to work out an arrangement with its neighbors so that it does not seem to be militarily provocative or aggressive in any way that moves all of these countries into the U.S. orbit and then forces a binary situation between the United States and China that could accidentally lead to some type of a military conflict. So it's very much in our interest that the Chinese, one, desist from building any more military installations or putting any more military hardware on the installations they've already built, and then also ensure that we are able to freely navigate by sea and by air all of those areas in the South China Sea, including right next to and above those so-called military installations the Chinese have built, because we are the only guarantors of freedom of navigation in that part of the world. And trust me, major powers like Russia and Iran, and even friends and allies like India, are watching the United States' response to this so they can determine how best they're going to position their own interests in similar large bodies of water.
Right. In plain English, they're going to see how far the United States will be pushed by China so that they know how far they can push us too. But I guess my question in the larger picture is why? If China knew that this would be provocative, and clearly it would be provocative, they're blatantly making this power move, and it's a pretty large one. What's their overall goal?
I think we sometimes have to understand and respect the fact that there are internal political interests at stake here. It's not always a matter of how does China or a country involved in similar gamesmanship playing itself out on the world stage. There is a very strong nationalist sentiment among a significant portion of the Chinese population. To whatever degree this particular Chinese government decided to play to that hand and try to bolster support from that nationalist element of the political spectrum of China, again, it's painted itself into a corner. Liz, they didn't even have legal representation at the court. They tried to dismiss this out of hand. Well, if you don't even have legal representation in the court, you really stand almost zero chance of winning the case, let alone a unanimous ruling against every single position that the Philippines brought against the Chinese. But my concern here is that there are domestic political considerations that are obfuscating the clarity that's required in Beijing to conduct itself as a rising, or some again might say a great power, in an area where many of its neighbors, for historical reasons and for current diplomatic reasons, remain very uneasy about China's ambitions in the South China Sea and even in the East China Sea neighboring Japan, and even in the Indian Ocean in the years and decades to come.
Right, that's a good point, that there's infighting not just in American politics, but in politics in other countries, particularly ones with as much wealth and power as China. John, what's going to happen to these islands then? If China eventually abandons them, will they be torn down, given to other countries, left to rot? What happens?
You know, that's a very open question. First of all, one of the charges in the ruling by the Hague court was that China conducted operations that significantly impacted, if not destroyed, very sensitive ecosystems, coral reefs beneath the surface of the ocean, on top of which they built military installations. I don't know if there's a way for China to re-engage in good diplomacy and at least restore those very sensitive ecosystems to their original state. But the other areas where they've built major runways, they now have airplane hangars and possibly are considering putting missile systems to shoot down any aircraft that overfly those areas. I don't think we know what the Chinese intend to do for some time to come, Liz. This is going to be a very difficult standoff, probably for months to come, if not years. And I think the best thing we can do is try to get China to work very closely with its regional allies to hammer out a diplomatic solution here so that the United States is not called upon to defend allies and become militarily involved, again, in a very distant and difficult part of the world. But stay tuned. This is going to be with us for quite some time.
Right. I hope you'll update us on this. It's interesting to hear you say that you think what will happen to the islands will be secondary to whether China actually abandons them or not. Please come back soon. Anything developmental that you hear or research on this, we'd love to have you back. John, we are out of time for today, but thanks for being here. Our next tipping point with Megan Barth is Loretta Lynch testifying before Congress. Stick with us. We're back in a minute.